So as you all know, Tennessee is 46 in education funding. Unfortunately, we're proposing different types of legislation without fixing our broken funding formula. We cannot move forward when we don't address the foundation. If Tennessee were to compete with a state that is closest in spending to us, which is Alabama, we would have to have an additional $560 million investment in our education system, and that doesn't seem like it's something that our governor and the administration have the will to do, which really makes it difficult for us to talk about innovation or meeting the very, very serious needs of our community if we're not going to address the basics from the beginning. But I'll tell you, like I said, student funding is a huge deal for us. We are in a crisis situation, and it's depriving our students of the resources that they need to be successful, and it's driving teacher shortages. We spend less to educate our kids than almost every state in the nation. We are 46 out of 50 in funding. And even though we can say, oh, it looks like we're spending more on our students each year, when you actually adjust those dollars for inflation, teachers are earning less than they earned in 2010. When you look at the increased cost of healthcare and other variables, they're earning less. They have to try and get another job to support themselves and their families. People are not even wanting to go into the teaching profession. We say that our teachers and our students are our greatest investment, but we're not actually living by those words. Our funding formula is broken. Teachers are not paid enough. It doesn't provide enough for teachers, and it doesn't provide the wraparound services that our students need to be successful. It also puts a significant strain on our local taxpayers because when the state doesn't send enough money down to our locals, then our county commissioners have to make up the difference. And a lot of time that comes with a property tax increase. So today we want to talk about fixing the school funding formula. That means an increase in teacher pay. That means we're going to support classrooms and teachers with the resources they need to be successful. And that means we're going to reduce class sizes, which is needed where it's needed the most. Before I hand it over to Senator Campbell, I'm going to introduce the first bill in our package. I'm sponsoring this bill with Leader Karen Camper in the House, and it's a pretty straightforward bill. We want to increase the state's share of teacher salaries. Under current law, 70% of the salary for every teaching position is generated by the funding formula, and it's paid for with state tax dollars. Our bill would increase that share of instructional salaries from 70 to 75%. Previously, the legislature funded these salaries at 75%, but that ratio was adjusted down a while ago, and it has not been bumped back up. And I'll tell you what, the BEP Review Committee, which has been advocating for change, it's a bipartisan committee of experts, has recommended this change for some time. It's the most direct way to ensure that we are providing more funding for our teachers' salaries. It's something that we can easily do. We have the funding to do it. And we can pass this legislation and we should pass this legislation without delay. Because if our teachers have the tools that they need to be financially secure and to be able to have the resources they need in the classroom, it's going to make a tremendous difference. We all know the strain and the work that our teachers have been under in this COVID environment, but even before that, having to spend their own dollars to supplement supplies in the classroom, working well into the night and on the weekends. We have a crisis in teachers and having enough teachers in the state. And the way to fix that is, one, to take better care of our teachers. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Senator Campbell, and she's going to tell us about legislation that she's offering this year. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator Akbari. I think we were all so hopeful that this special session would finally be addressing issues with education in Tennessee in a meaningful way. Everybody agrees, as Senator Akbari said, that our basic education program formula is broken. We are ranked 46th in the nation for student funding, mostly because of this broken formula, which underfunds our schools by well over $1 billion a year and 1.7 by some estimates. Unfortunately, instead of addressing the challenges Tennessee faces in a meaningful way, based on research and with the input of educators and school administrators. The legislation that was rushed through the special session not only may not help students, it may make things worse. So I am proud of the legislation I'm carrying this session, and especially excited about the education bills I filed with my House colleagues. In their annual report, as Senator Akbari said on the BEP, our own State Board of Education recommended that we make substantive changes to address problems with the formula. And so several of the bills that we filed came directly from their recommendations, including increased funding for response to intervention, also increasing the number of nurses and counselors. And look, we all agree that far too many Tennessee students are not reading at grade level. And we all understand absolutely the critical link between reading proficiency and academic success. That having been said, the third grade retention plan that we passed during the special session will require us to hold back third graders who don't pass literacy tests and have them repeat the grade. This is so concerning for many reasons. First, research definitively shows us that 50% of students who repeat a grade don't do better the second time, and 25% actually do worse. Retention is also strongly associated with the dropout rate in later years. Also, currently 34.7% of third graders in Tennessee read proficiently. And given the pandemic, the likelihood that we're going to see improvement this particular school year is really low. So this would mean that we are likely to see roughly 65% of third graders held back in this coming year. My colleagues and I believe that rather than holding students back, increasing the likelihood that they won't complete high school, it's time we start investing in our elementary school children, increasing the likelihood that they'll become proficient readers and successful students. Because of this, Representative Love and I have filed SB 376 HB 1000, which would reduce the teacher-student ratio in schools where more than 50% of third graders aren't reading at grade level. Research consistently shows that smaller class sizes result in a better educational outcome. And a big part of the problem with state education policy in general is that we have misaligned incentives, and of course, that we don't invest in our schools. So if we're really serious about improving education in our state, it's time for us to invest in data-driven, evidence-based policy that works. And I'm really proud to be working with my colleagues on legislation that addresses that. Thanks. And I think I'm passing it along to Senator Robinson. Oh no, I'm sorry, to Representative Love.
Thank you, Senator Campbell, and thank you all for tuning in with us today for our press conference. As has already been highlighted, there's an important need to make sure that we reconsider what we have been doing with our basic education program. And one area that I'm concerned about, and Senator Campbell is concerned about also, are the ratio of our school counselors. We have already talked about the fact that it's difficult enough for a child to navigate the process of education, but coming off of a pandemic, it's going to be even more important that our children have the adequate ratio of school counselors. And so House Bill 1001, Senate Bill 0371 would require the state to have one school counselor for every 250 students. This is very important because, as we know, children go through a myriad of things in their navigation and matriculation through education. And so school counselors help them. School counselors help them plot out their career choices. But more than that, school counselors also help them address issues that they may bring to the school with them. I'm not going to talk too much about it because I'm going to leave some room for Senator Robinson to talk about it, but adverse child experiences. Social workers and school counselors help out our students with this. And she and I carried a bill a few years back talking about ACEs. And this is why it's important to have the adequate ratio of school counselors in our school system to make sure our children can navigate, again, this process of education and grow and mature in a proper way. And so I would hope that my colleagues would support this initiative to, again, have one school counselor for every 250 students. And now I want to turn our Mic now over to Senator Robinson.
Thank you, Representative Love. And as Representative Love stated, we started this work in the 111th Assembly talking about adverse childhood experiences and how we can address the holistic needs of our students. And so we're continuing that work this session with addressing the resources that those students need in order to receive that type of holistic education that's required. There's a saying that says an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So for many kids, school is their safe haven. It's the place where they get a hot meal. It's where they have access to computers for homework, where they find their social emotional support. But this pandemic has created such a huge chasm for those students that they need even more support. So for example, since the pandemic hit, we have 14 times more students who have food insufficiency. So research overwhelmingly supports that social workers are increased in our schools so that we can meet the social and mental health needs of our children and teens during the pandemic as well as after. Our students and our families need social workers. Social workers are uniquely positioned to assess the social influences on students' functioning and their performance. They support the teachers by working with families on issues ranging from food scarcity to homelessness and parental addiction. They just play a very, very central role to helping teachers understand the students within the midst of their education. And quite frankly, our teachers have enough on them. They can't take on the burden of connecting students and their families to resources and conducting assessments to understand student needs. Those tasks, they got to be performed by a social worker, those who are trained to see the students' experiences in the context of their environment. Our social workers possess critical skills for facilitating partnerships within school communities. When we tried to address adverse childhood experiences, one of the main issues was, after we identify what this child is going through, how do we connect that family and that child with the resources that they need to support them through that? And so that's where the social workers come into play. They recruit those much needed outside resources and the wraparound services to address the holistic needs of the students and their families. And studies have found that the number of school social workers is positively associated with graduation rates in our high schools. The National Association of Social Workers, like Representative Love said, states that we need at least one social worker to 250 students as a best practice, so that they're able to accomplish real change in the lives of students and the school communities and to provide adequate support. But ACLU provided some analysis finding that even before the pandemic, 47 states did not meet the student to mental health expert ratio that's recommended by the US Department of Education. Not one state met the student to social worker ratio. The current ratio is one social worker to every 2,000 students. Can you imagine one social worker having to deal with 2,000 students and their families? Because we're not just talking about students. And so Senate Bill 1100 is an effort for us to continue the work that we've done in addressing the needs of our children as far as adverse childhood experiences are concerned, as far as meeting the needs of the family, and especially now that we're in a pandemic where we have kids in virtual schools. I know in Memphis, our social workers are doing the best that they can, doing virtual observations, having virtual office hours, but now that we're talking about returning to school, there's so much more that needs to be addressed when you have kids that have to readjust to the classroom setting. And so this is our effort to make sure that we have the support that we need to fortify our educational system for our students to have the best outcomes. So I appreciate anyone supporting Senate Bill 1100. Thank you. And Brandon, I'm sorry, I messed up. I don't know who's next.
That's
It's
okay.
Gloria, that's right.
That's me, I think. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about school nurses and House Bill 1331. School nurses are another critical resource that we have. And, we need one in every single school. Again, I just have to go back to one time I had a student, he was 16 and he was incredibly sick. And I'm not getting into the personal situation of why his TennCare had lost, his parents didn't have care either. But it was making it impossible for him to be successful in school. It wasn't anything contagious, but he came to school because of meals and things like that. And he could at least get us to look after him. And so we didn't have a full-time school nurse at our school. We finally found one at another school who had a nurse practitioner actually. And because he was 16, he was able to go on his own without his parents. And so we got him some help that way. But again, it's not just, it's having a nurse in the building, but to work with those families. Teachers are busy. They've got a classroom for kids all day long, and they can't be, calling parents, helping parents get the services that they need for their kids. That is something that a nurse can do. And we know that the reason kids are struggling with their academics and struggling with their reading at a young age is because they don't have the support services that can get these things that they desperately need in place. And that is why it's critical that we have more nurses, a nurse in every school, to take care of all those situations. Our kids are going to do better as long as they have all those outside support services. Summer programs, after school, those things can be helpful to a degree, but if the kids don't have the services that they desperately need, those things are not going to work either. And actually, if you're talking about a summer program that is not required, if you want to get that set up so that it will work for some of these families, you're going to need social workers and nurses and guidance counselors to help these kids and these families get ready for those programs in the summer and figure out how they can attend. Do they need some sort of help health-wise? Do they need some sort of help by getting transportation? Or so many kids, I can't tell you how many classrooms I've been in where I've had to go to the home with either a nurse with a child with health issues or a social worker. And we get to the house and it's because a family member is sick that child is staying home, or because they're doing childcare for a young member of the family because for some reason the family lost childcare. You don't find these things out unless you have these support folks in our schools to go and make those things happen. And last year we cut the $250 million mental health fund, and that would have really helped in this situation, but we cut that to add to the rainy day fund. So we know, especially the pandemic has exacerbated this, and these support services are going to make the difference. What we find, kids do better in their subject area and they are more successful when they have these wraparound support services that provide the supports that they need, especially in struggling families and struggling communities. And it's just critical. If we want to see these kids make gains, we need to make sure that they have the supports in place they need. And we're going to do that by making sure that we are funding the support services like nurses and workers and guidance counselors. And I think that next up is Rep. Hakeem.
All right. Thank you very much, Representative Johnson. I guess I'd like to comment firstly that it seems the common thread in what we're talking about is that the broken BEP system at this time. And, it gives me great pause when I think about the fact that, we've lowered some business taxes, we've lowered some inheritance taxes, we have over $1 billion in rainy day fund, and yet the basics for our children to move forward, we're not making that investment, in my view, as we should. And one of the areas that Senator Campbell and I are sponsoring together, House Bill 840 on my end and 370 on her end, deals with response to instruction and intervention. And bottom line is we get to identifying that a child is having difficulties, having problems, and not waiting to the end of the year to address that with a parent, but within the system, our school system, addressing those concerns when they come up. The first signs of challenges that children may have. This is not something I'm going to use a term that we thought of yesterday. The framework for this intervention was put into place in 2014, and it became mandatory from between K and 12, high school. A problem with it is that each intervening teacher has 2,750 students that she has to deal with. That seems to be a rather unreasonable number to expect, to have the results that we'd like to have. And, really the system that we have in place now has reached its capacity. And the bill that Senator Campbell and I putting forward together will reduce that to 1,000 students. Now, we may say that's not well enough, but I think it's quite a distance from where we were previously. And as I said, this is not something we thought of yesterday. In 2017, the review committee, the BEP review committee, saw this as a top priority that needs to be dealt with. Assisting our young people with learning disabilities. And the program needs reform and real resources. So, and these are best practices that are used nationwide. So hopefully among the other bills that have been put forth, that these are seen as necessities, things that we need to do, not that we ought to do. I'm saying that we talk about lowering crime and we talk about young people moving forward. They have to have that foundation. And this is what we're working toward. And thank you for this opportunity. And I believe Representative Torrey Harris is next. Am I correct?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So House Bill 0438 and Senate Bill 1059, along with Senator Campbell, this legislation directs the Department to develop and administer a system of grants to LEAs to supplement funding for the LEAs that they receive through the BEP for special education. This additional funding is to be used only for special education needs. And that is it. It is not to be used for anything else but for special education needs directly. Through the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, federal dollars are sent to the state and from the state to the school districts. Over the years, that amount has constantly fallen short of the goal set forth in that law, putting more strain on the state as well as the school districts themselves. We need appropriate weighted funding that follows the child. Under the current basic education program formula used by Tennessee, an average $9,500 per student amount is given to schools, and it does not take into consideration the additional needs to properly educate a student. To properly educate a student in special education or with special needs, it costs roughly $16,500 per student with a disability. And the formula only provides about $9,500 of that. So this bill would close that gap even just a little bit to allow LEAs to request from the state up to 30% in addition to the BEP allowed amount. It takes so much to provide the rich and personalized programs for the whole child, from full inclusion, self-contained environments for our children, multiple certified special education teachers and paraprofessionals, nurses, counselors, social workers, behavior analysts, speech language pathologists, and even psychologists. And right now, the BEP that we use, the formula that we use, does not touch on all of this. And we have got to get to the day where student-based funding is a priority. I'm super excited that this is even becoming a discussion because so often our students in our special education programs are an afterthought to education. And this puts it on the record that our commitment is to our students. My mother has taught over 20 years in specifically with students with disabilities and special needs. And so I get it. And we can't keep treating each student like they are the student in the advanced placement courses. Although on a federal level, there are so many changes that need to take place to provide states with more funding, our state is in no way struggling financially. We are financially sound, and we can take on putting more funding into our students. So we do not have to wait on the federal level to do what we can do here on a state level. Like most of my colleagues and said about their bills or any of the bills that have been put forward, I have not received back the physical note on this bill. So I appreciate anyone's support on House Bill 0438, but I'll turn it over right now to Senator Yarbro.
Thanks, Representative Harris, and thanks to everyone for joining us. I mean, each one of these proposals that's been outlined today matters significantly to families across the state. I've got a rising kindergartner and a sixth grader myself, and if we actually followed the BEP in my children's schools, they would lose a counselor, an assistant principal, numerous teachers, their school nurse, their art teacher, and reading intervention specialists, and the list goes on. Part of the school funding conversation in Tennessee is actually complicated when it deals with how much the state is going to spend versus the local match. Part of it, however, is very simple. There's just not enough money in the formula. It assumes, the BEP assumes that there is a fraction of the teachers that are actually in schools, and it assumes that the teachers that are in schools make a fraction of what it takes to actually hire teachers. And so we're basically funding 75% of schools through the BEP. I mean, you know, we have a K through 12 funding system that basically funds K through 9 and then leaves 3 grades, you know, entirely on the local. And so when people make the statement each year that they're fully funding the BEP, it's really a hollow and empty statement. I mean, it's basically you're paying the interest on, you know, the minimum payment on a credit card, and you're ultimately falling further and further behind as a state. As Chair Lady Akbari outlined at the beginning of this, we're currently 46th in per pupil education funding in the state. It would take approximately $1 billion investment just to get out of the bottom 40. We're not talking about anything that's wild or outlandish. We're talking about catching up with Alabama here, catching up with the states that are nearby that are also historically low funders of education. We're falling behind to the very bottom of the barrel, and it's just not acceptable. And so rather than actually do the hard work of thinking through making this an investment priority for the state, committing to a goal over several years, instead we see too often the legislature or the gubernatorial administration rolling out the latest idea or things that are frankly sometimes just gimmicks, rather than doing the hard work of actually paying teachers and schools as they are paid in every other state in the nation. And this just simply has to end, and it's not hard to do. So Leader Camper and I will be running a bill, which I believe is Senate Bill 808, which incorporates many of the proposals that we talked about today. And they're not, we've talked for a while, but they're not that hard. It's basically, we want to make sure that the BEP pays for all the teachers that are in schools, that the BEP actually pays their full salary, that schools have nurses, counselors, and reading intervention specialists, which that's pretty much the bare minimum that it takes to run a functional school system. And if we did that, we would have to, I think we would likely increase our BEP funding by probably 20-25%, which I think is right around $1.2 billion. But that's literally just to get us out of the bottom 10 funded states when it comes to education. That is really the bare minimum of what our moral obligation is to the students. And it's what's necessary if we're going to match the rhetoric that has been used by Tennessee politicians for decades now. Every year you will hear politicians from this state will say that education is the most important investment we make, but we just frankly don't live up to it. And it's time for Tennessee to start walking the walk here. And this year we actually have an opportunity to do that. The receipts are in from, the surplus in our current budget includes almost $1 billion of recurring revenue, most of which could be dedicated to really making up much of this gap this year. At the very least, there should be a 1 to 3 year plan to actually get to adequate funding. The basic education program just simply is inadequate right now to meet the basic needs of every school in the state. And it's time that we start being honest with ourselves about that and take it on as the priority that we all say that it is. So thanks everyone for joining us. I want to turn it over to you for questions, and we'll try to address any particular issues you might have.
We did have a story
that we need to address that's in there.
Hi, this is Marta at Chalkbeat. So I hear you all, and I also know the realities of our legislature at the moment, and the minority status that that your party has. I'm also hearing the focus of the GOP controlled legislature now seems to be more on weaponizing the BEP than increasing funding for the BEP. And at the same time, I know that there are certain Republican lawmakers who have had proposals through the years to increase things. For instance, school nurses. I know that Representative Hawk has had a bill for some time to try to increase school nurses. So I guess I'm asking realistically, can there be some sort of bipartisan effort to chip away at some of these things, knowing that there has been also some Republican efforts to address a few of these matters?
Thanks, Marta. And while we're a minority in the legislature, we are with the majority of the voters in Tennessee when it comes to this. You can't find a community in the state that thinks that the state is actually pulling its weight when it comes to funding public schools in their community. You just can't. I think that part of that is we've got to set out a vision and start setting what a goal should be, which I think partially these bills lay out what we think is the step to get to adequate, frankly. This is what it takes to pay teachers and actually fund the school systems that we have. This isn't the funding to actually to build upon that. It's the funding that's needed to pay for what we're doing right now, basically, without putting all of that weight on local governments. I think there is room for bipartisan work. As you mentioned, there are Republican legislators that bring similar bills to some of these over time. And I think basically everyone recognizes that this is something that the state needs to do. What I don't think, I think that people are currently frightened off by, they get confused by the formula, but I think that it's really the fact that they don't want to get into the small cities and big city, local match debates, which are usually what actually complicate this for people. And I think you have people that are frankly have just not placed this in a high enough priority. And I think it's time for that to change. I think that can happen. And I think that all of us will be working with our colleagues across the aisle to try to make that happen.
We have some questions in the chat. I don't know if you can see them or if you'd like me to read them off. Can you see the questions?
So do we have any buy-in from rural lawmakers? It's asked by Stephen Elliott. Oh, and then I'll try to move up. So, I mean, I think that, again, I think we're still in the midst of having these conversations. I know that we have some agreement by lawmakers that this is a problem that needs to be addressed. Now, and I think that you have even broader assent in rural communities that this needs to be addressed. And we're going to, continue to work on actually bringing some of our colleagues from across the aisle into the further piece.
Jeff, I'm going to jump on that a little bit as well.
Yeah.
So I mean,
Go ahead,
obviously there's, for sure. There are opportunities for bipartisanship when it comes to education. I think that at least in my experience in the House, there's always been an emphasis on public schools typically and fully funding them and providing support for teachers from some of our colleagues in rural areas. Obviously, I think with the school voucher vote, there were some surprising deviations, but I think some of that has already been fleshed out. I think Ian asked a question about school nurses, social workers, and counselors, and how we can recruit them. Obviously, I know you said funding aside, funding is such a big portion of it, though. But I will tell you, we have ample folks in that arena. The problem is they're going into different fields because they're not able to support their families. So I don't know that we can separate funding from that because that's how you can build a house and you can have not enough workers on the construction site and you can have really bad materials and the house has no longevity and it's going to fall down. I think when you talk about our school system and you say, okay, well, we're not going to fund the experts that the children so desperately need. And we're not going to fund the teachers in a way that makes it more comfortable for them to be in that position. Teacher burnout is real. And I'm not a teacher, so I'm going to let Representative Johnson jump in on this. But when you have nurses and social workers and teachers who can make more money doing all sorts of other things, and they have this intense pressure on them, one, the passion, they burn out. Two, no matter what they want to do to help children, they also have to be able to support their family. And it really shows a priority in how we act as a state when we're unwilling to use our budget to fund those positions.
Absolutely. And the bill for social workers actually came from social workers at the University of Tennessee. They desperately want to work in schools. There is so much. Social workers are needed everywhere, but they really love the work that is done in schools because you can see it happening on the day that you do the work, and you can't necessarily with all the other work. But I don't think there's going to be any shortage of finding those folks to come on board with the school, because for so many people, it also is conducive to, if they have their own kids, to be on a school schedule. So there's a lot of great reasons that nurses and counselors and social workers would want to work in a school setting. We just have to have the ability to pay them so that they do come and work for us instead of choosing something else. There's just no question that there are folks who want to do this work.
It should also be noted that some of those positions are actually already filled. There are more nurses in Tennessee schools than the BEP assumes. There are more social workers and counselors than the BEP assumes. People are doing it, but the state's just not funding it. And one of the reasons that salary increases never actually have the bang for their buck that the legislature intends is that those salary increases pay not just for the teachers and instructors who are in the BP, but all the instructors and people who make schools work, who local systems have to pay for themselves.
Ian, did you have another question?
No, thank you. I appreciate it.
Peter, did you have a question? All right, if we have no other questions, I guess
Oh,
we'll
I
wrap
have
up.
one more then.
All right,
May
go
I?
right
Go
ahead.
ahead.
Just going to let other people ask first, but I wanted to ask one more thing. It's about mental health of our students, our social emotional health. When I talk with superintendents, that's kind of the cloud hovering over everybody. A lot of concern about the trauma that students, teachers, school communities have been under, and what, when things get back to normal, whatever normal is with the pandemic, dealing with the fallout of that. Last year, before the pandemic hit, the governor proposed a $250 million mental health trust fund that seemed to be at least some effort to start to address an issue that others have been just giving lip service to for so many years. This year, he's proposed $6.5 million toward mental health, student mental health, in a year when now we know it's really going to be needed. So I just love to get your thoughts about the need right now. I know certainly your discussion about social workers and counselors and nurses all speak to that, but just the broader issue of what we face, what we don't even know what we're going to face with student mental health coming down the pike.
Right. Marta, that was something I did mention, that mental health trust fund that they had. And I think that was going to yield around 7 to 8 million a year. And, we talked about how that wasn't enough. And that was before the pandemic. That was before families have gone through going without, with unemployment and going without a paycheck and losing their jobs. And, I don't know that this affects kids every day in their classroom. You think you might be keeping those secrets from your kids, but they know. And when their mind's on what's happening at home, their mind is not in the classroom. And that's that's why it makes such a critical need for these social workers and counselors and things. And so that mental health trust fund was created before we had the pandemic. And to cut that and, put that money in the rainy day fund, I think was a terrible idea. And right now, a big investment in these social workers and in these nurses and in these counselors can help us take up that slack and really take care of these students as they come back with the needs that they're definitely gonna have. And so if mental health is an issue before this pandemic, how we cannot make a greater investment now just boggles my mind.
Agreed. Well, thanks everyone. If there are no further questions,
Senator
we
Campbell had a
will.
quick comment.
Oh,
I
go
just
ahead.
wanted to make a quick comment, and that is that holding kids back is not going to help with mental health either. So our third grade retention plan in the special education bills is going to be bad for kids' mental health. And I think that's, also an issue that we need to address.
I think that's right on. And I think the other thing that just bears noting here is we need to have some education goals that we stick to as a state. You know, it's not just about having good education headlines at the beginning of session. And so having a mental health trust fund that gets announced but never enacted may signal that you care about the social emotional learning of children, but it doesn't actually improve that. Just as I think the focus on literacy this year without the investment isn't going to be as successful. And so I think that we all have to be resistant to just hearing what the latest idea is when the state is structurally this underfunded and underinvested to actually act on any of these goals and priorities it announces. So we hope that the governor will join us in this, and we'll be working with colleagues, both Democratic and Republican, to try to move this forward going in the next few months. So thanks everybody for joining us. We'll talk to you soon.